Welcome to the Sports Science Dudes. I'm your host, Dr. Jose Antonio, with my inimitable co-host, Dr. Tony Ricci. If you're a first-time listener, hit the subscribe button and like the show. We are on YouTube, Rumble, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Our special guest today is Rick Collins. He's an internationally recognized legal authority in the field of sports nutrition, bodybuilding supplements, and performance-enhancing substances. He is a partner in the law firm of Collins, Gann, McCloskey, and Barry. Add one more person. You got a basketball team there, buddy. And he currently serves as the president of the Nassau County Bar Association. His career is actually filled with a whole bunch of highlights, so I figured I'd just list a few of them. Otherwise, we'd be here for like hours. General counsel to the International Society of Sports Nutrition. That's pretty cool. You've probably seen his column in Muscular Development. It seems like you've been writing that for years. How many years, Rick?
I think we're close to 21, 22.
Wow, that's awesome.
That is longer. That is older than some of my college students.
That's
so.
right. That's right.
That's insane. Also, you're author of Legal Muscle, Anabolics in America. You're also the co-author of the Alpha Male Challenge, which you probably do a second edition of that because
we're probably ready. Yeah. It was before its time.
We need more alpha males.
We need to alpha up too, Rick. We need you again on that.
I know. Believe me. We'll talk about that.
Hey, Rick, I don't know if you remember, I wrote this paper in 1996.
Wow.
Yes.
Yeah, we're old fuckers.
Yeah.
And I want to use it as a sort of an introduction to the topic of testosterone. The title of the paper was Androgen Use by Athletes, a Reevaluation of the Health Risks. I'll give you the punchline. Myself and my co-authors, we basically thought that the dangers of anabolic steroids or testosterone were greatly exaggerated. And honestly, we used the word fabricated, but the journal editors, they took that word out and they put exaggerated. Now, there's sort of a weird backstory to it. When we submitted this review paper, the genesis for it was we went through this book called The Pharmacological Basis of Therapeutics by Goodman and Gilman. It's like the Bible of pharmacology if you're in pharmacology school, medical school, even if you're getting a PhD in the biomedical sciences. And when we went to the section on anabolic steroids or androgens, the three of us, and we're just stupid grad students, we're like, this is wrong. And not only is it wrong, it's almost like they fabricate evidence to support a conclusion they came up with a priori, i.e., androgens or anabolic steroids are lethal. It'll kill you. It doesn't help athletic performance, yada, yada, yada. So we decided, you know what? We're going to challenge the guys who wrote that textbook. By the way, one of them is a Nobel Prize winner, so don't let that impress you anymore. Right. And we submitted it to about 7 journals, and they rejected it. All of them rejected it, and this is the reason. This is the more the fascinating part. And we had to do it by snail mail. God forbid we couldn't. It was like we had to write letters, lick the envelope, mail it out. All of the editors said, we agree with your science, but we can't publish it because it's politically sensitive, which is weird for a science journal. But hey, last 2 years, it's no longer weird. A lot of science is bought by politics. The last journal to reject it, Canadian Journal of Applied Physiology, they first rejected it. And then we get a letter, snail mail, 2 or 3 months later. They said, you know what? I think we're going to accept it because if we don't accept it, someone else will. And the controversy is good for our journal. So that 7th journal said yes to it. And the funny part is everyone agreed that the science was correct, but they didn't want to publish it. Right. What does that sound like? The last 2 or 3 years, right? So that serves sort of as a backdrop. And that's, oddly enough, Rick, I don't know if you know this, but that's part of the reason I left doing research in that field, because I felt that it didn't matter what the data showed.
Right.
People have weird preconceived opinions about testosterone, about anabolic steroids. I mean, this idea of toxic masculinity. I mean, when I first heard that word, I'm like, what's that even mean? What the hell is that? So anyhow, you've been doing this for a long time. You have a lot of endurance in this field. Sort of give us your bird's eye view of, you know, how the public views testosterone, even how science views testosterone.
Right. So a good jumping off point, I think, is 1988 when Ben Johnson ran his 100 meters and broke all the world records, and at the Seoul Olympics in 1988, and then proceeded to test positive for Winstrol. Sinazolol. And suddenly this Canadian sprinter beat the American Carl Lewis. The sports world was turned on its head, and the powers that be in Washington were confronted with this issue of, wow, what happens if sports become a contest of chemistry? And so a whole bunch of hearings were held in the late 80s that were investigating what should be done about steroids in sports, this whole issue of performance enhancing drugs. And Congress came up with the idea that the way to get rid of it would be to take anabolic steroids and put them into the same infrastructure, the same architecture of the Controlled Substances Act, which is used for methamphetamine and cocaine and heroin, traditional recreational drugs of abuse, right? And so testosterone and steroids became essentially the apple in the orange crate of the Controlled Substances Act, because they're the only hormones that are there, and the only drugs that are used not for a psychoactive effect, but for a physical performance or cosmetic effect. And
Right.
so that process began the tarnishing of the reputation for testosterone. Claims by folks like Lyle Alzado back in the day that his brain tumor was caused by his use of steroids or growth hormone added to it. We've had a number of scandals through the years, going back to the Balco case, where I represented the chemist in it, to the baseball scandals that happened a few years later. So you've got the first reason I think that there's a stigmatizing of testosterone as opposed to estrogen, which is kind of the counterpart. Nobody's saying anything bad about that, right? Is this idea of the enhancement of athletics, that you can hit harder, run faster, jump higher with testosterone or anabolic steroids. The other part of it, I think, and you touched on it a little bit, Joey, is this idea that testosterone is almost a metaphor for masculinity. And we're now in a culture where traditional masculinity is maligned. It's no longer seen as something worthy or good. The American Psychological Association in 2019 came out with a position stand about traditional masculinity. And what did they say? That traditional masculinity is toxic. It's harmful to boys and men. Traditional masculinity is kind of throwing out all the qualities of masculinity, of courage or protectivism or thirsting for ambition, anything, drive, throwing all of that out and focusing only on the negatives. So that's the context, I think, with which we come in 2023 to testosterone and masculinity.
Do you think, and you mentioned Ben Johnson, and by the way, that was the greatest start in Olympic 100-meter history. He was out of the blocks like bat out of hell.
Then just quickly, Joey, when you have your number one finger up in the 100-meter with 15 meters left,
Yeah, that was,
you got a good start.
Yeah, that was an amazing race. What are your thoughts, though? Because you've been in the bodybuilding world for really quite a long time. That I've always thought part of the stigma against testosterone or anabolic steroids or androgens is the origins of its use. At least the public perception is from bodybuilding, even though I think cyclists have been doping on this stuff at much higher doses and far longer than bodybuilders. But in the United States, who pays attention to cycling except like 5 people? So what do you think the contributions of the bodybuilding culture has been to the stigma?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think bodybuilding has, and Tony and I have talked about this, bodybuilding has always been sort of a fringe out there. It's maybe a little more mainstream in more recent decades. Before that, I remember when I went to law school, I was the only person who looked like me in the law school. There was no other dude in the law school who looked like me. And I think there were certain assumptions, preconceived notions about the big guy, because I just come out of competing in bodybuilding. So I was my bodybuilding connections were, you can't hide it. You could be a cyclist, you can be a gymnast. Nobody's going to know when you walk in a room. If you're a bodybuilder, it's clear to everyone. There's certain preconceived notions that go with it in terms of intelligence. And of course, I was there on a full academic scholarship, right? I was there, one of the few who was there for that. But I think there were assumptions that I was not going to make it through the first year of law school. Oh, the big dumb guy, right? And I doubled down as bodybuilders sometimes will do. So I was wearing my hat on backwards and a scoop neck, T. Michael shirt and the atomic
Long
sleeve.
Island 80s bodybuilding gear.
Yes,
at
the
Hustler,
whole
right?
pajama pants, the huge, multicolored leopard print, the whole thing. But yeah, so that's bodybuilders have never been an attractive constituency for any legitimate political clout. Also, I think that, look, there's a certain threatening quality to hypermuscularity that I think on an evolutionary level, we're kind of, most people have evolved to be concerned about the alpha, the alpha male who is bigger, stronger, more capable, potentially going to take the better resources, whether it's the animal on the Serengeti who is going to get the larger amount of food, the better mates, etc. So I think there's a certain threatening quality to it. Probably the only population that can be completely trashed today without any repercussions. Any other subpopulation, whether it's based on sex, race, weight, you can't touch these things without being canceled. But there's nothing wrong with a commercial that has, I lift things up and put them down and make fun of the big meathead and then show him out the door of your health club.
Well, in a way, that's a backhanded compliment, because that means you're not sensitive to stupid shit. I mean, that's what it boils down to. Now, I think also the general public has this perception that I'll call it the recreational use of androgens is just bodybuilders and, let's say, high-end athletes, but it really isn't. Tell the audience about some of the research you did on that, because I think it surprised a lot of people.
Yeah. So we, back in the probably 2004, we started collecting data, and we ran a internet survey of over 2,000 bodybuilders and nearly 2,000 American male bodybuilders to kind of figure out what's going on. What are the demographics? What are the motivations? Who's using steroids? Why are they using steroids? How much steroids are they using? What are the usage patterns? What are their backgrounds? And we published it in the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition. Thank you very much. And my co-authors and I presented there's been some research done since that essentially has found the same thing, and it supported some pre-existing research. But basically, I'll put it to you this way: if we were to look at the average non-medical steroid user, we found was a single, highly educated, gainfully employed, white-collar worker earning an above average salary in his late 20s to early 30s, who started steroid use in his mid 20s and was not and is not involved in any competitive sports of any kind. And we found that 80% of users of anabolic steroids in a non-medical context were not really using it to compete in any sports or arguably for performance, but really for cosmetics. Anabolic steroid use for most people is kind of the counterpart of breast implants or liposuction or cosmetic surgery. It's a cosmetic aesthetic tool that people are using illegally, and certainly in the United States, although laws vary across the globe, but are using it to look better. Basically look better on the beach without a shirt on. That's essentially what steroid use is about.
So can I ask a question quick, Rick? If we were, and this is an assertion now, right? But because we don't have full data, would we see a similar demographic even now if we were looking at those? Because it's amazing how many people are getting it prescribed and using it medicinally at a younger and younger age too. But what's your thought on what that demographic may look like for those who have consulted or seek the physician for the therapeutic use? Would it probably be a similar demographic, broader, older, same income range, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I think so. We have to divide, although there's somewhat of a muddy line potentially, the medical versus the non-medical use.
Right.
The non-medical is arguably only okay for people in countries outside, some countries outside the U.S. You cannot be prescribed, and that's the, steroids are a Schedule III substance, federal, Controlled Substances Act. That makes it illegal to prescribe for a non-medical purpose. So it must be for a medical purpose. So anybody who's using it for cosmetic purposes, in theory, is not getting it from a doctor, is getting it from the black market. And I understand there's certainly an overlap in a muddy area in some cases. The body of folks who are using it medically, and there's some argument as for what medical use is. Certainly, hormone replacement physicians who are involved in TRT have a very different idea of what's medical treatment versus the more traditional endocrinologists who mostly deal with obesity and thyroid issues. That's essentially their wheelhouse. Traditional orthodox endocrinologists would say that unless your total testosterone levels are 300 nanograms per deciliter or less, you shouldn't be prescribed, regardless of symptoms, any kind of testosterone. Whereas more progressive minded TRT physicians would see it very differently. But I think that certainly there's a huge number of men now who have discovered TRT, typically in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and are using it arguably for medical purposes because they're starting to slow down. There are some body fat, body composition issues. There's maybe lagging sex drive, all sorts of things that are associated with testosterone decreasing. And as you know, after the age of 30, the levels start to go down about 1% a year, right? So at 40, you're down 10% from where you were, which is probably a lot less than when you were 19, right? And at 50, so replenishing that is the idea. And is there a certain cosmetic or performance improvement for those folks in addition to the medical? Well, yeah, there's certainly evidence that testosterone is very good for body composition improvement.
And actually, sort of dovetailing with the fact that it helps body composition and the fact that at least 2 out of every 3 Americans is overweight or obese, it makes it even more surprising that testosterone is vilified, and particularly if it's known that a male, whether he's young or middle-aged, is taking testosterone really to look better, lose fat, gain muscle. That's vilified, yet women routinely get Botox, butt implants, breast implants. Any of those surgeries certainly are I would purport is much higher risk than taking, a couple 100 milligrams of testananthate or SIP, weekly for cosmetic reasons. Yet our culture, for whatever reason, and comment on this, both of you, seems to, it's almost like we make fun of those guys who just really want to do something, and I'll call it natural, because you still got to lift weights, you still got to eat well. It's not like you're going under the knife and all of a sudden you show up looking nice. But in women, it's very accepted.
Total double standard, right? Total double standard. Could you imagine criticizing a woman for a choice in some sort of cosmetic procedure? Immediate cancellation. But on the other hand, a guy who wants to look bigger, larger pecs, bigger arms, he's just seen as just a vain person, and ultimately he shouldn't be able to do that by the use of anabolic steroids. You can, of course, if you go to your doctor and you say, look, I want bigger arms, the doctor can say, oh, I can't give you a course of anabolic steroids. That would be unethical and illegal, but I'll put some prostheses. I'll basically put you under the knife, subject you to general anesthesia, all the risks of infection. I'll cut open your biceps. I'll cut open your triceps. I'll put in these fake implants, and your arms will be bigger. And that's perfectly okay and medically ethical.
Tony was thinking of that, but he undergoes hypertrophy much too easily.
No, Tony doesn't need that. Tony's got one true genetic specimen.
To everybody, so let me reveal this. Rick has been a great counsel for me on this, and I mean it, because I used them for a short window in my life as a bodybuilder, and I personally didn't like them. There's no moral argument here. And I just didn't like the way I felt. I mean, I liked the way my body felt. It was absurd. I think I changed in 3 hours. Now, I'm not exaggerating. I don't mean I look like the Hulk in 3 hours, but I was like, wait, what's going on here? But anyway, my point to it is, you've given me so much great information on the evolution of this and how this can be utilized safely, and where we are with it, and the pros and the cons. And I mean, I think we're getting to a position now, though, right? And from the research, because I don't dive into it, but the therapeutic applications in the dosage, Joe, you mentioned what, in that 200 milligram range, do they appear to be side effect free almost? Like even in chronic use, not
right.
Yeah.
You can even go as high as, I mean, there's studies going back to the 1990s, 600 milligrams a week for 10 weeks. With no side effects. That was Testosterone. So,
and do we think that could happen over? I know we're asking, but even as high as a 600 over 10 years. I mean, but you don't need that, right?
You don't need that.
Right. Okay.
I mean, I would guess, and Rick, I'd like your opinion on this, but if you're doing 600 milligrams a week for 10 weeks, you could literally cycle on and off that. Or the alternative would be just do low dose for a long time. I think either would work well in terms of reducing body fat, increasing skeletal muscle mass, and if you give a shit about strength, you get stronger. So, right. What do you think?
Of course, either of those options, if they're for the purposes of building muscle and not for medical use, somebody's getting in trouble for that. Whether it's, I mean, and therein lies the problem. Mm-hmm. It really is a very much of a double standard. It's interesting that when testosterone and anabolic steroids were put into the Controlled Substances Act, that in the hearings that preceded it, the FDA, the DEA, the AMA, and the National Institute on Drug Abuse all sent witnesses to testify to Congress, do not do this. Do not make testosterone or anabolic steroids into controlled substances, because they don't have the same potential for abuse and dependency as LSD or cocaine or oxy, etc.
Yeah, the speed drugs are really bad, right? And they're in that category, the methamphetamines.
And Congress just ignored it. Congress wanted to get steroids out of the Olympics and out of sports, and so this is what they did.
Yeah, I remember the hearings, Major League Baseball. It was just an absolute circus, and I think it was Jose Canseco that basically ratted out.
Yeah, he did. Jose, he did.
Everyone. He wrote a book on it.
He was at the Arnold one year, I remember. Yeah.
So if I guess I'm not familiar with the legality, but let's say you're someone at the gym, you happen to sell it to your friends. What is the legality of possession? Like, how much do you have to possess? And is there a type? Is it injectable versus oral? And also, if you sell it to someone legally, where does that fall?
So in the most general terms, typically, federally, if you possess an anabolic steroid of any amount for your own personal use without a prescription outside the medical context, that's a misdemeanor. If you give it, exchange it, sell it to somebody else, that's a felony. And most states have somewhat similar laws, although there are states where the mere possession of any amount, one tablet of Dianabol, is a felony in some states. It varies. So each state has its own laws with respect to everything, including anabolic steroids. But as a general term, if you're a possessor for personal use and it's a fairly small amount, you're probably either, if you do get arrested, you're probably going to be able to work out something that's not going to involve any jail time. But I've been involved with cases across the country of all types. I've represented people possessing anabolic steroids, selling them, making them, manufacturing them, importing, you name it, I've seen it. So I've seen probably more of the dark side of anabolic steroid legalities than anybody. And I understand that there's an interest in the government of keeping drugs of all types. And these are, look, all drugs have side effects. We can talk about that they've been exaggerated or to some extent, some of it indeed fabricated, but all drugs have side effects, and certainly the difference between a medicine and a poison generally is the dose. But certainly we wouldn't want kids to be using anabolic steroids without any medical supervision or need, et cetera. So we have some interest in that, but there is an argument that there should be more of a libertarian approach, and that if it doesn't affect anybody except you, then why is it illegal? You know, we allow people to take all sorts of risks. I've done 5 skydives, right? I mean, you know, it's some would say it's crazy, right? I'm taking all these risks, yet you can smoke, you can drink alcohol to excess, you can eat your way into type 2 diabetes. Nobody's stopping you. That's the idea of personal health autonomy. Yep. But yet, with respect to this, somebody's going to get handcuffed if they're selling it to somebody else.
And the irony is, if you're taking it and losing fat and gaining lean mass and exercising, you're healthier than like 99% of the American population.
Yeah, if it keeps you moving more, we're ahead of the game right there, right?
That's right.
Yeah, there. And the thing is, like, I mean, we all know about sarcopenia, age-related loss of skeletal muscle mass, and it's a huge issue. Testosterone would be one of the very best things you could give, at least to males. I mean, females, there's going to be a little bit more risk, but just to help prevent or alleviate some of that sarcopenia. But you don't really hear it talked about. I mean, I've talked to a few, quote, anti-aging doctors who are all for it, but most of Western medicine, at least most American Western medicine, they just have a really weird view of it. And I've always found it odd. It's like, wait a minute, testosterone's probably safer than a lot of the other drugs you prescribe, yet you're quite fine prescribing those other drugs.
Yeah, definitely a backwards kind of view. If you look back on the history of what's presented to the public about anabolic steroids and testosterone generally, we remember in the 1980s when there was research showing that steroids don't work for any sort of sports performance or sports involvement. I mean, just absurd stuff. And that was, I think it was all to, I think what we see very often is that studies are used to control the population to do certain things or not do certain things. And so when we were asked to follow whatever the science is, the science is what people, you know, in some authority want us to do because they think that's in the best interest. And whether the information given to us is true or not is not necessarily as important as shaping the behavior to get people to do certain things. So preventing people from taking steroids was sort of their idea, and telling them they didn't work was the way that they figured this is the way we'll shape their behavior.
Yeah, I remember, I don't know, Tony, if you remember back in the 70s, the American College of Sports Medicine had a position stand on anabolic steroids.
I'm not familiar with that.
Okay, they said it was lethal, it was dangerous, and it didn't work. Oh, yeah. And athletes who read it, they're like, oh my God, these people are stupid. But it gets better. In the 1980s, they did a revision of the position stand, but this time they said, okay, it kind of works, but it's still lethal.
Right.
And here's the funny part: it was based on no new data.
Right.
So
and anybody who was involved in the bodybuilding or steroid worlds knew that it was complete BS.
Right.
And that's kind of a problem, is that when you just lie and you're just presenting false information, people then begin to disbelieve everything you say. Even if there's some stuff. I mean, again, you know, taking massive amounts of C17 alkylated oral steroids will rot your liver out as much as drinking 2 gallons of scotch a night will, obviously. But, so when you say that when you exaggerate the risks, you sometimes make people believe that there are no risks. And that, I think, it was a backfire.
Exactly right.
That they should have seen coming.
And fatalistic hyperbole is dangerous, because
Right.
if you're told you're going to die in an hour and you feel
you
better
live.
than ever, we got a problem on our hands, right?
Yeah. Somebody lied.
Yes. Right. Hey, Rick, I have one question too, and because I don't know how to word it properly because I'm so unfamiliar with it. But when a physician can prescribe this, independent of what the therapeutic application may be, because of its scheduling or where it is in that class 3, do they have to undergo different training or paperwork, or is there anything that is different on their behalf? Is it only a specific discipline, a physician, for example, for therapeutic application that could prescribe testosterone? Because honestly, I know nothing about that. And I know a lot of my buddies too are confused about it who haven't done it yet.
Sure. So physicians or healthcare practitioners, it varies, but you need to be authorized by the DEA in order to prescribe something that's a controlled substance.
Okay, got
and
it.
There's triplicate reporting. So one of the reasons why controlled substance status exists is for the purposes of tracking who's, well, let's keep an eye on these prescriptions. And it's the same as with oxycodone. There's a tracking to see if a doctor is prescribing massive amounts of oxycodone. You may get a little knock on the door from the DEA who says, wait, what's going on here?
Got it.
I want to sort of switch tax into I guess a more controversial area in terms of testosterone usage. And you had mentioned this to me, that perhaps this will be the thing that changes the way testosterone can be administered, and that's in the transgender community.
Mm-hmm.
That when you look at transgender individuals who want to go from female to male, that it is okay, it is socially acceptable for them to take testosterone. Because at the end of the day, you're making a physical change, which is what normal males who want to look better, gain muscle, lose fat, in essence, they're doing the same thing. They're making a physical change. So a socio-cultural question, why would one be acceptable and the other not be acceptable? And the second part of that question is, will this eventually lead to it being, I guess the word is descheduled? I'm not sure what the correct legal terminology is. What are your thoughts on that?
So I'll deal with the first question first. And that's a question that I asked with 2 co-authors in a journal piece that we wrote and submitted, which was looking at those 2 kind of scenarios: the physical enhancement of the healthy bodybuilder or healthy physical culture person, and the person assigned female or born female seeking to make some changes in terms of gender identification. And we looked at it from the perspective of a psychological disorder perspective. And that is sort of gender dysphoria against muscle dysmorphia. Gender dysphoria is the DSM-5 disorder, identity disorder, where, hey, I'm born in the wrong body. I was born in this female body, but I identify as a male, as a man. And so I want to use testosterone to change my phenotype to comport and comply with how I feel on the inside. And muscle dysmorphia is the name that DSM-5 gives to what we might think of as bigorexia, sort of reverse anorexia. In other words, the person who looks in the mirror, typically a male, who looks in the mirror, although it can happen certainly in females as well, but looks in the mirror and says, I don't identify as the 140-pound person that I see in the mirror. I identify as a 240-pound, solid, jacked specimen superhero. And I want testosterone to change my phenotype so that I can identify, my phenotype and my self-identification are in line. Now, we asked that's essentially another way of asking your question. And we looked at that, and, you know, in no way were we suggesting that the two are on the same level or necessarily should be treated the same. I think how you identify from a gender perspective obviously is much more integral to who you are as a person, rather than simply, hey, I want to be more jacked. I get that. You know, I'm not comparing them or equating them in any way, other than that in one, it's celebrated and encouraged that, oh, yes, if you're born female, we can prescribe testosterone so you can be further along that non-binary trail toward maleness, even if you don't want to be fully male. And there was a interesting article I remember reading before we worked on this piece, where a person who had been born a female basically said, you know what? I am so happy. I'm being prescribed testosterone. I don't want to be a man. I just want to be more masculine. I want broader shoulders. I want a wider jaw. I want to be able to grow a beard. I want to present myself because I don't feel like a woman, but I feel non-binary. And so I want to present this non-binary phenotype to the world that comports with who I am. I've been prescribed testosterone, and it's the best thing that ever happened to me. And I'm reading it, and that certainly, if stripping away the gender identification stuff, there's a cosmetic component to that, clearly.
Sure.
And which is what the muscle dysmorphia aspect is. It's purely cosmetic. I get that, but it also goes to how you see yourself. There's a certain self-identity component to your muscularity as well. And so we asked the question, not suggesting that if you want to get jacked, you should be given, you know, a cycle of steroids. We weren't saying that, but we were saying that the difference in treatment between one being, you know, essentially looked upon with great favor in our culture today, and the other where handcuffs are going on and you're going to jail if you're a physician who supports doing that for a bodybuilder for non-medical reasons, that disparity is too great. I mean, that's a Grand Canyon of difference, and does the difference, the admitted existence of the difference between the two, justify a gap, a gulf that wide? And so we asked that question. Needless to say, we got pushback in the peer review process, you know, asking those sorts of, wait a minute, are you saying that, you know, somebody who wants steroids to get bigger muscles should just be given? Well, no, we're not saying. Are you saying these two things are the same? No, we're not saying that either. We're just saying that these two things have never been compared or looked at in this way before. And one is like A-OK, and the other, somebody's going to prison.
Exactly.
Is that warranted?
Exactly.
And it was published, and it's in the Journal of Addiction, and you can read it. It's a great question about, you know, whether the current status of those two things in a policy way is justified or not.
Well, I'm not sure how to phrase this question, because it goes back to your comment of testosterone as a metaphor for masculinity, and I'll throw the adjective toxic in front of masculinity. But when you have a female to male transition taking testosterone, does that necessarily mean, I don't believe this, but they're becoming more masculine, i.e., is it sort of moving to toxic masculinity? Because apparently masculinity is frowned upon socio-culturally now. So, but why is it okay for a female to male transition to be celebrated when in fact they're becoming more masculine?
Right. Yeah. These are great questions that I think, you know, we can speculate about how our culture turns a blind eye to certain issues that may, for sort of political, cultural reasons, but you're right, nobody's really seeing it in that way. And which leads to kind of the second issue, the second question that you had, which was, will there be some sort of descheduling at some point? And that's, I would have said absolutely not until very recently, because as I started reading more and more articles from the trans community about testosterone, I saw more and more complaints that testosterone criminalization, that the controlled substance status for testosterone was anti-trans and was improperly stigmatizing and denying trans people from getting testosterone as they would any other drug. Why should men or people assigned male at birth be able to access estrogen more easily than people assigned female could access testosterone? Right. This is an anti-trans law. And of course, we live in a society where everything is about you, right? So, so from the trans perspective, this law was designed in a way against trans people, at least some argue that. Obviously, the trans community had nothing to do, wasn't even on the radar screen when this law went into effect. But it certainly, there is an argument that it does prevent equal access to hormones for people who are born one gender versus another. And so 2 US senators actually wrote a letter to the Biden administration asking them to take testosterone out of the Anabolic Steroid Control Act or out of the Controlled Substances Act, or to bring it to a lower level from 3 to maybe 5, or remove it completely because of its effect on the trans community. And of course, bodybuilders and steroid users everywhere in America were like, we've found this strange
rallying call.
It's a strange bedfellow that we found. Politics makes interesting allies, and now suddenly the trans community and those who use steroids for physical enhancement find themselves cheering each other on. Whether it'll actually have legs or not remains to be seen. I'm not sure that those senators really understood who's using testosterone primarily and why. And I think that they saw it purely as like this trans issue, which, when somebody actually explains it to them, they may have a different view. But it was interesting to even see that.
Yeah. So can I ask one quick question, Rick? And forgive me my lack of knowledge, but that's why we have a Rick Collins. Is it possible to take a drug and schedule it in one class based according to its therapeutic application? In better words, what I'm asking is, well, would be schedule this for this therapeutic application, but it may stay scheduled here for another therapeutic application. Does the whole drug come down independent of what it would be prescribed for, or can it actually move across?
Yeah, I would think that there are ways. I mean, Congress can do what it wants, right? So
right, okay.
There are ways that, so for example, anabolic steroids are Schedule 2 in the state of New York. They're Schedule 3 everywhere else. That doesn't even make any sense. So New Yorkers have a greater abuse and dependency for steroids than New Jerseyans? I mean, it makes absolutely no sense,
right.
And so, and there are some drugs. There's one drug, Xyrem, that is actually Schedule 3. Well, it's a form of GHB, which is Schedule 1. So there's some sleight of hand that could potentially be put into place. And I would think actually that if there were to be some relaxation of testosterone in terms of its criminal or controlled substance status, it would probably have some sort of safeguards that would make it not in the same availability for those who just want to get big and jacked.
Got it.
A couple more topics, and then we'll have to let you go. You got to be respectful of your time. We'll get to the Can Testosterone Turn Democrats Red, which I think is kind of a funny headline of your article. But before that, there's a lot of people who don't realize that low testosterone in and of itself clinically is harmful to males. And the first thing that comes to mind is it's associated with depression. What are some other things that low T are associated with from a clinical standpoint that you're aware of?
So I try to keep myself in my wheelhouse as lawyer and not
avid reader.
Nothing I say is legal advice or medical advice or anything like that. But but certainly there are a lot of people who are on testosterone replacement therapy who feel enormously better while on it. Their body composition changes, they have more energy, they increase their muscle mass, they perform better in the gym. They're inspired because they feel better, they're inspired to eat better, they're inspired to train more. So all of that is positive. There are links to depression with low testosterone. There's certainly mental health issues that present as well. There have been some studies using testosterone in the context of type 2 diabetes for men who are hypogonadal, meaning they have low testosterone, which seems to suggest that testosterone might be good adjunctive therapy for diabetics, especially for who have major, body composition issues. So all of that is important. I think we've demonized the hormone partly for the reasons of sports, partly because of the kind of metaphorical closeness to masculinity, which is also not something that's looked on favorably today.
Yeah, and I'll even add to that there is a huge volume of data showing that testosterone helps wasting conditions like with HIV patients. Even a lot of people are unaware that they've given it to pediatric burn victims, so children on androgen. So there's a lot there that I think the general public isn't aware of the benefits of testosterone or its any of its derivatives. Now
they only hear the bad side. Yep.
Yeah, only hear the bad side. Now this is kind of I'm going to flip the question on its head. Can estrogen turn Republicans blue?
You mean testosterone or estrogen?
That's such a politically charged question. I see what you did there. Yeah.
You caught me backward. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll talk. You wrote this great article. Can testosterone turn Democrats red? And I actually, well, give us the details, because when I don't know where I saw this first, but I just laughed at it because there's got to be something funny to this. Because I mean, it's just got to be funny. So, what do you think?
So, I read this piece by a researcher named Paul Zak, who has studied various oxytocin and testosterone and other hormones to kind of look at behavioral effects. And he did this study on 136 college students, male college students, where he asked them what their affiliation was politically. And he divided them into 4 groups: the strongly affiliated Republicans, the weakly affiliated Republicans, the strongly affiliated Democrats, and the weakly affiliated Democrats, and kind of looked at them into those 4 buckets. Then he gave them testosterone. He gave them a dose of testosterone, increased all of their levels, looked at their levels to make sure that they all increased, and then questioned them about their political affiliations and political feelings. And what he found, and this was maybe not what he expected, but it was fascinating results, because what he found was that those who were strongly tied to Republicanism didn't change their thoughts or political ideology. Those who were strongly deep, hard blue Democrats didn't change as well. The weakly affiliated Republicans also didn't change their political views. But the weakly affiliated Democrats flipped over to the Republican side. Wow. So the weakly affiliated Democrats turned red. Now, why? Why were they more receptive to, they asked them about different Republican politicians. They were much more open to it. And so the question is, how do you interpret that? What does that mean? And it's speculated. It was a small study. It would have to be replicated. It needs more study, all of that stuff. But, one thought was that those who were expressing themselves to be Democrats, weakly affiliated Democrats, were doing so because they were afraid to call themselves Republicans in today's academic climate, which is predominantly, to which you both could tell,
we're in it,
could verify, certainly swings far to the left. And so admitting that you're favorable to republicanism was difficult. And the testosterone gave them the courage to come out as the Republicans that they actually were, if they weren't too entrenched in the Democratic ideology. That's one interpretation of the evidence. It was a fascinating study. I love this stuff. He's going to follow it up hopefully someday with some more stuff. But he does say in the article that when you look at traditional, when you look at bodybuilders and you look at those who are, involved in physical culture, they tend to skew to the right. They tend to skew, a little
Such as the entire UFC.
Right. Yes. So, and it makes sense too, because and I did a column in Muscular Development a few years ago about kind of like the issues of where you would fall in terms of socialism versus, more of a capitalist kind of perspective. And there have been studies, and bodybuilders skew capitalistic, because I think it's the idea that you need to put in the time, you need to work, that effort is that what you get is earned, that nothing is handed to you, that nothing is, that equity. I don't think typically they don't have an idea that equity should be even for the guy who puts in 2 hours a week in the gym versus the guy who puts 8 hours a week in the gym. The guy who does everything right. So I think bodybuilders, just because of, we've every ounce of muscle, every quarter of an inch of arm girth is something that blood, sweat, and tears went into. And so bodybuilders tend to be much less socialistic in terms of economics, because I think that same sort of mindset translates.
That's a lot of chicken breast, buddy. A lot of chicken breast.
I think we could just look at the hormonal profiles, prefrontal cortex, and corpus callosum of we libertarians, who are correct anyway, and just prescribe that to everybody. That's how we can do it.
There you go.
I'm surprised they found any Republicans on campus.
Yeah, well, you guys, you're dealing with this on a daily basis, right? I mean, you're seeing the politics play out in 2023 campus life.
Yeah, I think I forget what survey this was, but roughly 90% of faculty, just sort of across the board on college campuses, tend to vote Democrat. If you go into the fields like physics, engineering, math, it tends to skew right. Some more of these sort of hard sciences, but hey, we've run out of time. Rick, this has been a really fun conversation. There's a lot. I mean, I love the field of testosterone. There's so much that we could talk about, and I think to me, the most fascinating part of the discussion was how the trans community and the bodybuilding community are now bedfellows.
Rallying together, baby.
If you had told me 5 years ago that's what would happen, I'm like, Rick, you're insane.
Yeah.
Where would you get this, Rick?
Yep. Well,
so
2023, it's happening.
That's right. Tony, any last words for our good friend Rick?
Just follow Rick where and when you can, because I don't say this because he's a good friend, but I've never walked away from him not knowing more than I did after. A really smart guy who was willing. Rick, what I love about you is you'll talk to anybody anytime, and great conversation, and everybody benefits from it. So thanks, my friend. And everybody follow him, and there's a lot to be learned, and you have a lot of fun along the way too. I think that's even better.
Yeah, yes, I do, and we have, and we'll continue to. Yeah, follow me on Instagram. That's a good place to. Rick Collins Esq. I'm easy to find, and thank you both for hosting me on the show. I had a blast, and hopefully we'll do it again sometime.